Dr. Todd Borlik from the University of Huddersfield. I teach Renaissance literature, and I'm going to talk to you today about the emergence of the disaster epic in 17th century England and compare those versions with some more recent incarnations of it on the Hollywood big screen. All right, so we'll begin in the year 1524. Strange thing happened this year when some dire astrological predictions argued that a conjunction of 5 planets in the constellation of Pisces would unleash a tsunami-like deluge that would inundate the Earth. There are reports of ark building going on throughout Europe at this time, and on the night of January 31st, allegedly 20,000 people evacuated the center of London in a state of mass hysteria. Now, obviously this did not occur, and I think this anecdote reveals some troubling aspects of apocalyptic rhetoric in environmental discourse. Now, Lawrence Buell famously calls apocalypse the single most powerful master metaphor in environmental writing, but clearly there's a danger here of a boy who cried wolf scenario happening, right? Greg Gerard thus warns that apocalyptic narratives can oversimplify and sensationalize the problem. And in a classic essay, Susan Sontag excoriates Hollywood disaster films from the 1960s, saying that they basically normalize us to this descent into environmental degradation, right? They make it bearable. A similar argument has recently been advanced by Justin McBride, who says that catastrophe narratives amount to capitalism realizing its own principle of becoming extinction. So it's a kind of masochistic acquiescence to things going to hell in a handbasket. In contrast, Lawrence Buell cautions that what we need are narratives about slow apocalypse, right? Of the not with the bang but with a whimper variety. And many eco-critics cite the distinction by Stephen O'Leary between tragic apocalypticism, which he says promotes despondency, right, hopelessness, versus comic apocalypticism, if that's not an oxymoron, which O'Leary tries to say is about promoting resilience, right, in the face of calamity that might inspire us to avert, right, or at least mitigate some of these problems that we're facing that are of our own making. Now, to further illustrate the virtues and the vices of the apocalyptic, I want to turn to a neglected poet, Michael Drayton. He's seldom read today, but I firmly believe he's the first real eco-minded poet in English literature. Not coincidentally, he is also the godfather of the disaster epic and writes a series of works late in his career that really anticipate modern cli-fi. One of them is called The Moon Calf, and it's based in part on the Book of Revelations. There's the figure of this pregnant woman who represents Mother Earth, who goes into labor, and that prefigures the end of the world. One of the tales by Mother Redcap describes a toxic rainstorm that drives anyone it wets completely mad. Incidentally, it's possibly that was an influence on Shakespeare's King Lear. Another poem, To William Brown, speaks of the catastrophe unfolding at his time and says that England has gone arsi-varsi, which of course is what catastrophe literally means in Greek. It means an overturning. The 10th Nymphal is a prophecy of a completely treeless Britain in which our distant descendants are forced to live in underground caves, and they're all starving and freezing to death because there's no more wood to build houses or light fires. And then the 2 poems I want to talk about mostly over the next few minutes are Noah's Flood and a poem on Moses and the plagues of Egypt, written both in 1630. Now, interestingly, the Noah's Flood poem revives that astrological prophecy from 1524 of a planetary conjunction in the watery constellation of Pisces. So it might seem far-fetched, but of course to Drayton's contemporaries, astrology is not a pseudoscience. What he's actually doing is trying to give some scientific credibility to the biblical flood narrative. And Drayton actually says that humans have brought this upon themselves through human ingratitude and sinfulness, mistreating the earth, and that overpopulation is a problem that we've become, our responsibility, our guilt's been diluted because there are so many of us. Drayton's also trying to refute skeptics who argued that the flood story was fictitious, that it was just a myth. And you can make some curious parallels here, I think, with climate change denial today. Now, to make this case, Drayton draws on, I think, 4 different lines of evidence. First, he points to the size of Renaissance argosies to claim that prehistoric shipwrights could have constructed these massive floating stables like the one you see here on the slide from the Geneva Bible. He also says that primordial humans allegedly were at least twice our size, so the cubit would have been correspondingly large, and therefore the dimensions given for Noah's Ark in the Bible would be much, much larger than they seem to us. And then, shockingly, he says that the number of species on the early Earth was much smaller than it is today. And he says that animals actually would have changed, right? They would have evolved to adapt to variations in climates and soil. So he's making actually a proto-Darwinian argument here in the 1630s about mutability of species. And he even cites marginal notes that this is the opinion of the best naturalists that have written. He's referring here to Lucretius, who proposed this theory centuries before Darwin. Finally, Drayton draws on the theory that water is just air condensed, he says, in a footnote. So again, he's trying to create a kind of scientific framework that makes the flood narrative seem feasible, seem credible. He even says that wind impregnates the center of the earth, and then it's condensed there into water, and it overflows all of the subterranean aquifers so that the earth is flooded both from above and below. Now, the readers of the Moses poem wouldn't have needed much convincing about the reality of the 10th plague. They'd lived through plague. A horrific plague occurred in Drayton's lifetime in 1603, killing an estimated 60,000 people in London. Another outbreak happened in 1625 and again in 1630. The one in 1630 killed over 1 million people in Italy. And in England, there are reports of 16,000 citizens fleeing the city in a state of panic. So this is the atmosphere in which Drayton's apocalyptic disaster poetry appears. Now, his disaster poems haven't been studied very much. William Aram kind of justifies this, saying that Drayton's work isn't particularly poetic, it's just retelling what's already in Genesis and Exodus. And he chalks this up to a Baconian skepticism about imaginative truth, and sees Drayton as someone who's trying to affiliate himself with Baconian truth of fact. And I think there's some grounds for that, as I've established, that there is an attempt to make these stories seem scientifically believable. François Lavocat makes a similar claim about catastrophe narrative emerging in the 17th century because of the birth of a fact-based culture. But Lavocat goes on to say that catastrophe fiction borrows from the Baroque novel a concern with individual destiny, empathy, and personal response. You don't see very much evidence of that in Drayton, because the Baroque novel doesn't really exist in 1630. Instead, Drayton is inspired by a different set of genres, which I'll discuss in this slide. First, the early modern broadside. These are basically one-page newspaper reports, often recounting actual disasters like the 1607 Bristol Channel flood or the 1625 plague. Almanacs are hugely popular in the 17th century. They outsell the Bible, actually, for much of this period. And they contain prognostications of extreme weather events, like that 1524 flood caused by the planetary conjunction. Third, there is a large number of scriptural commentaries about these biblical calamities. And even scientists are trying to interpret these stories and to reconcile them with contemporary knowledge, right? To create a science of prophecy. Even Isaac Newton believed that Noah's flood could have been caused by a comet that passed too close to the earth. Finally, most importantly perhaps for Drayton, is the precedent of epic. Judeo-Christian epic, like Du Bartal's works, and classical pagan epic, like Ovid's Metamorphoses, which also contains a flood story. These are significant because they provided Drayton with a pattern for talking about disaster fiction in a way that makes the weather, right, the environment, the star of the show, right, this focal point of the narrative, rather than the human protagonists. Drayton isn't particularly interested in the plight of Noah's contemporaries or the poor Egyptians, right? He makes the disaster itself really the focal point of the poetry and the narration. Now, we could make some interesting parallels with Drayton's poems and some recent Hollywood films. Now, I think in 2014, when 2 different Hollywood studios released 2 biblical disaster epics, they probably weren't intending an homage to this obscure Jacobean poet. But I think these films allow us to see an eco-critical edge in Drayton's work, and also think about some of the distinctions between literary epic and cinematic disaster epic. Now, Aronofsky's Noah film does have this epic scope. You can see on the slide here these cosmic long shots. The one on the left showing the Earth being corroded by these black spots, which represent the industrial civilization of Tubal-Cain. And then there's a counterpoint to that later on, where we see the Earth blanketed in 1,000 swirling hurricanes, a shot possibly inspired by the media coverage of Hurricane Sandy, which had just ravaged the eastern seaboard of the U.S. Is this a satellite view, or is this God's eye view? Right? It's perhaps a bit of both. Right. So Aronofsky gives a kind of a familiar shot drawing on satellite imagery to make a biblical story seem plausible. Something similar happens in Ridley Scott's Exodus. Now, this might seem just like a glitzy remake of Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, updated with all the latest CGI special effects. But Scott's also trying to update the story for the Anthropocene. He makes the Egyptian plagues seem credible. That is, the turning of the Nile into blood isn't caused directly by this divine intervention. Rather, it's a group of crocodiles pack hunting that disturb all this red clay on the Nile bed that turns it into this red sludge. Even the crossing of the Red Sea is caused by a fortuitous conjunction of strong winds and low tides as a cold front moves through. So Scott's deliberately trying to make this seem very believable, in the same way that Michael Drayton is trying to make the plagues seem credible to an audience in the 17th century. Both Drayton's poems and these two films try to make the audience believe in climate disaster. Right? Drayton is facing the Little Ice Age, a period of a lot of dearth and inclement weather, with massive flooding that occurred the year he writes his Noah Floods poem. And they persuade the audience by appealing to scriptural precedent rather than to, say, scientific predictions of the future. So they're relying on what's happened in the past rather than what scientists might say could happen. I think these films also might encourage us to think more about a post-secular environmental humanities. There aren't many forums in which people on the right and left of the aisle can talk about climate change productively. But using biblical disaster epic might be a way in which we could forge a broader coalition of the concerned to motivate climate action. I'll end with a quotation from Jeffrey Cohen about the need to revisit the Noah story. He says that often the way it's told could simply produce despair, right? It could create that kind of tragic apocalypticism that, this is all foreordained, God means for this to happen, and we're all doomed. Instead, Cohen says, let's turn to other versions of the Noah story that might promote resilience, right? That the Noah myth can become an archive, as he calls it punningly, of hope that allows us to all collectively come together to contribute to future making. Right? So I think that's a very uplifting note on which to end. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Take care.